Good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome. I'm so happy to see, I'm not surprised, but I'm very happy to see a full house. My name's Martina Droth. I'm the Paul Mellon Director of the Yale Center for British Art, and it's such a pleasure to start this academic year with such a special program, the conversation between Lord Norman Foster and Dean Deborah Berke. I want to extend my gratitude to the Terry F. Green 1969 Fund for British Art and Culture, which enables us to host important programs like this. The program today is part of our Architects in Conversation series, which is inspired by the building in which we are here gathered. Of course, I needn't tell this audience that our building was designed by Louis Kahn, whose legacy here at Yale has brought so many significant influences. This was Kahn's final museum. He died before we opened in 1977. And of course, he also designed the Yale University Art Gallery, which is right across the street from us. And also in the 1950s, a little further up Chapel Street, he designed what was at the time the Jewish Community Center in 1954. And half a century later, or 25 years ago, that building was renovated by our very own Dean Deborah Berke and turned into what is the School of Art today. So we find ourselves on this incredible architectural campus, and I can't think of a more perfect way of marking the beginning of the semester with our first Architects in Conversation program since we reopened after a 2-year renovation. Our esteemed colleague, Deborah Berke, will be convening today's conversation. She is the Edward P. Bass Dean of the Yale School of Architecture and the J.M. Hoppin Professor of Architecture. And of course, she is both an architectural educator and a practitioner. And her leadership here at Yale is very much combined with the creative work of her celebrated firm, TenBerke. And her vital contributions to the field have received many honors, but I will mention that this year in 2025, she won the AIA Gold medal. Deborah Berke will be in conversation with our very special guest, Lord Norman Foster, a Pritzker Prize laureate whose work has redefined skylines around the world and hardly needs an introduction, but let me just say, the personal connection here at Yale is, of course, that he is a distinguished alumnus of the Yale School of Architecture, a place to which he has returned both his vision and generosity, not only through the masterful design of the School of Management, but also his ongoing commitment to nurturing the future generations through the Lord Norman Foster Visiting Professorship, which he generously endowed. I'm thrilled that Lady Elena Foster joins us today as well, and the whole family is here, so welcome one and all. There'll be some time at the end for questions, so hold your questions, and if you're joining on the live stream, you can type your questions into the Q&A feature on the portal. But now, please join me in very warmly welcoming Dean Deborah Berke and Lord Norman Foster.
So those of you from the architecture school know all too well that I spend much of my time in front of you introducing people. And my dear friend, Norman Foster, has done me the enormous favor of offering to introduce himself, which I welcomed so warmly. So Norman, that's the extent of my introduction. It's all yours.
It's almost 64 years ago to the day that I came here for the master's course in architecture. I graduated 1 year later and started in practice in London 1 year after that. And so by way of introduction, I thought I'd share some reflections, some thoughts going back to those early years and more up to date. So for me, I guess that architecture starts with the social agenda. What do I mean by that? The power of design to improve the quality of our lives. materially and spiritually, to bring some joy, to bring some beauty, to anticipate change, the power of design to equalize, to anticipate a future. In other words, an optimistic view of the future. If those are the aspirations, then what are the means? The means, I would suggest, are technology, and closely aligned to that, the culture of technology, the lessons of history. So if those are the means, then there's a direct link between technology and sustainability. One is the key to the other, whether it's climate change, global warming, quality of life. And that is inseparable from working with nature. It's no accident that when we started in practice in the 70s, and I'll give a glimpse of that, it was the birth of the Green Movement, but it wasn't called the Green Movement at that point. I'd also like to touch on the importance of the team, of multidisciplinary working. The idea that architecture is too important to be left to architects alone, that a holistic view of the world demands a simultaneous inquiry creatively by all the professions working together. And that's not designed by committee. That is empowering designers with more knowledge of the issues. And my final key word, connections. Connections could be inspirations from other disciplines. It could be the link between those of us who study as students and the link into future practice. It can be the connections between an early idea, an innovation, technology and innovation in terms of change for the better, the way in which you cannot innovate all the time, but hopefully some of the time you'll innovate, and then you will build on that innovation, evolution, if you like. So that journey, perhaps for me, started in this building at the age of 16. I left school at 16, and for 2 years, I worked as an office boy in this extraordinary Victorian masterpiece, mid-19th century, by Waterhouse. I have vivid memories of that. That was my first taste of architecture. I was 2 years there, and then afterwards, 2 years compulsory national service in the Royal Air Force. Another building that was so important in my life was my local library, a Carnegie gift. I discovered Le Corbusier, I discovered Frank Lloyd Wright, and at the age of 21, as a late starter, I started the course of architecture at Manchester University, a 5-year course. And this was my very first design. And the title is interesting because it says Boathouse Retreat. It's one building under one roof. It's a boathouse. At that time, I imagined a love affair with this extraordinarily beautiful speedboat on Lake Windermere and bringing the two together. It was a romantic idea. And in a way, it's been inspirational ever since, because the original brief was for 2 buildings. It was a cottage and a boathouse. And bringing the two together under one roof, that unifying device has been a constant throughout my professional career with colleagues, whether it's the workplace, whether it's cultural buildings, airport terminals. It's always the unifying factor of a single roof umbrella at a heroic scale or very modest, as at this scale here. So that brings me to 1961, 62, and Yale with colleagues here. And I single one building, a 6-week program for a tall building. And as I was describing earlier in a conversation with students earlier this morning, that I had no experience of tall buildings from my Manchester background. Low-rise buildings, yes. I asked Paul Rudolph if I could work alongside an engineer. And of course, this was anathema to Paul Rudolph, who believed that the master was the architect, and the architect, then the engineer, was a servant to the architect, and you passed the parcel. And against all convention, he found an engineer to work alongside me. And that has been a formative influence ever since, because I found I was empowered. I had more knowledge by that parallel working. I was stronger, if you like, as a designer. The interesting thing about this building is that it challenged the idea of the conventional tower with the central core of services, which has been, up to this point, arguably, the dominant model. And instead, and very much on reflection, in the spirit of Louis Kahn and this building, the idea of served spaces and servant spaces, so to create loft-like spaces with the cores dissolved between those lofts. Talking about parallel working, this is a glimpse of the time I worked as a collaborator with Buckminster Fuller for the last 12 years of his life. But the significance of this image is that the group around myself and Bucky comprise environmental engineer, structural engineer, cost consultant. We're all focusing together. So if this was the birth of the practice in the 1960s and 70s, it's interesting that these words at that time of solar, harvesting energy, harvesting wind power, recycling waste to fertilizer, desalination, this was a fringe activity in the 60s and the 70s, spurred by the astronaut's view for the first time, Earthrise, the razor-thin layer of the atmosphere around the planet captured on photographs, Rachel Carson, Silent Spring. So the birth of what would be called the Green Movement. An early project of the 60s, arguably one of the first after leaving Yale, was for a small electronics factory. And the client for that factory had designs already prepared by architects and builders. And so typically, the factory at that time was the management box and the workers' shed with all its class associations of clean and dirty, rich and poor, we and they, with separate entrances. And coming back to that idea in the boathouse of the all-encompassing roof, instead, we proposed a democratic pavilion with a single entrance for everybody, unified standards, and through innovation, completely transforming the industrial environment. And one early innovation in this cut through here, the bottom right-hand side, you'll see those small red pipes. Those are not only structural reinforcement in the slab, but they're also small bore pipes that will pump hot or cold water. Far, far more efficient than moving vast quantities of air through unsightly ducts. So that innovation, and more than half a century later, we're seeing the same technology here in the Apple headquarters in Cupertino. And perhaps just in passing, these prefabricated concrete elements treated as a noble material, honed and polished so that they become the finished ceiling in the workspaces. And similarly, as in the Reliance of 1967, where the recess between the structure is the lighting. So a systems approach, a holistic approach to something which is fairly familiar as an image, and really countering the questionably fashionable idea that concrete is an evil material. There are no materials which are evil. It's arguably one of the pillars of our civilization. It's how you use it. And here, where you're using it as the environmental conditioner with those as a radiator, where you are reducing the height of the building, reducing the extent of the expensive external wall, it's highly economical and highly sustainable. Another building which in many ways reinvented the concept of the workplace, of the office. The office had been conventionally a tower with the central core. And here, something that became known later as a ground scraper, a deep building that would be animated by natural light at its heart, a low, deep building, better for communication, and arguably a minimum envelope enclosing, in sustainability terms, the largest volume. And that anticipated, perhaps in lifestyle, the workplace of the future. I revisited this building recently for its 50th anniversary, and it's very much alive and well. You ascend towards the natural light, to the sunlight, a roof garden, and a very, very large swimming pool. At the time of the relocation in the 1970s, no such amenities were available in that particular market town. I talked about the power of design to anticipate a future, and in the small factory to address inequality. Interestingly, the technology of this building, which has a void, not a fully access removable floor, but access at that time, 1.5 meter centers, 5-foot centers, the access to power. So this building started in the age of the typewriter, and unintentionally, it anticipated the digital future. So interestingly, as Willis Faber often recount, unlike their competitors, they didn't have to build afresh. Literally, their building was adaptable to the future, to the digital technology. And also in the 1970s, 1979, there was this competition for the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank, with a banking hall at the heart. And that great void was made possible of the banking hall and the reinvention of the tall building for the first time, not a central cord model. And it is interestingly, it is the previous dean here who noted that the birth of the Hong Kong Bank was in that student scheme in Paul Rudolph's class that I alluded to earlier. Another significant building of that period was the Sainsbury Centre for Visual Arts. And coming back to that idea of the all-encompassing roof, for the first time, this brings a public museum, a major collection, visiting exhibitions under the same roof as a faculty of art devoted to the history of art. And that as a very tunable light box, total flexibility, not art on the walls, but a system of movable screens and vitrines and controllable top light, and serviced discreetly from below, a very discreet linear basement of services. And that was the model for the innovation of reinventing the airport terminal. So this brings me to the early 1990s. And the typical air terminal, here Terminal 4 at Heathrow, this is what you would see. massive servicing, air ducts, mechanical plant. If you looked at what was on the roof to make that possible, then you would have all this roof-mounted equipment, no access to natural light, and highly difficult to actually service and maintain when you realize that an airport is a 365-day-a-year operation. So the complete retranslation of that, literally turning it upside down, opening up the roof for natural light, some joy, free energy, highly sustainable, and the image of that, a model which has since been replicated by designers worldwide. If that was an innovation, then in the many airports that we've done since, one example of this is Beijing, we have evolved over time that model. And interestingly, we've now come to the point where the terminal in the world's largest airport, which is a competition that we recently won in Riyadh, the scale is such that the airport is now a mini city. And if you think the way in which airports have organically grown over time with other functions, then in a way it is natural that it becomes a kind of urbanity in itself. And that's a reminder that some of our most important works in terms of transforming the quality of life urbanistically in the center of London, I give one example, which is Trafalgar Square, which was not only a traffic roundabout, but a pedestrian roundabout. And going back then to the late 1990s, the transformation of that. And it's interesting that so many people have forgotten its roots originally. So very, very quickly, before that transformation, the center of the space was more for pigeons than anybody else. That has now become the kind of cultural heart of the metropolis for all kinds of events. I talked about the team and multidisciplinary. Coming back to Deborah's point about the associations of art and architecture in Yale, I thought I would finish where the team includes those who are devoted to issues of culture, the role of the artist, and a small project in Nîmes, a competition from MediaTek, essentially a cultural center, visual arts, performing arts, and the ripple effect that that has had on that community. On the top of that building, you can see the roof terrace. And if we look back at the Roman temple opposite there, then it's a reminder of the historic roots and the power of this building for an urban transformation, a kind of ripple effect out from culture. I was invited back there 25 years later by the community, and they said, we give you this building and you can mount an exhibition of your choice throughout all the galleries. So I'm there literally hanging up the work of an Icelandic artist here as part of that venture. And then the Reichstag. The Reichstag conceived not only as a manifesto of green energy, zero carbon in the 1990s, but also about public space, the most visited. And here, the ramp which ascends you to the viewing platform and is very much a part of the ecology of the building. And perhaps a reminder that culturally, it hosts the work of about 20 artists. And I worked with each of those artists, and here with Gerhard Richter, who asked me if we would provide technical advice on his first work in glass, which you can see in the portico. And there's a very, very nice link right back to the present. Next month, we have the formal opening of the JP Morgan Tower. And here, in these two works by Richter, you can see the continuation of that tradition. And not too far from there is the Hearst building, the base of the building, and the way in which that integrates right from the art set two artists, Jamie Carpenter, also an alumni of Yale, and Richard Long, and the way in which that is part of the entry experience of that building. And then finally, the Norton Museum in Palm Springs, the way in which it recycles some of these buildings and pays homage to this 200-year-old banyan tree. Literally, the canopy embraces it. And under that canopy, the signature work of Klaus Oldenburg in a reflecting pool, and the memorable opening day of that institution, and the way in which it rallied and brought together across all sections of society an extraordinary transformative effect, a reminder of the power of culture and the power of the arts, which brings us right back to this building, this collection, and this extraordinary event. Thank you.
So Norman, that was great, and thank you. Because I think not only is this an extraordinary event and in one of Yale's extraordinary institutions, but Yale itself is an extraordinary institution. We are proud to count you among our most accomplished alum. But I would love it if you could talk a little bit, for the sake of the students, about your time here. And I want to preface this for a minute by describing it as a stool with definitely 3 and maybe even 4 legs. And I'm going to give those legs names. So leg 1 is Paul Rudolph, right? Great architect, great architectural educator, interesting background, son of an itinerant preacher originally from Kentucky, never a student at Yale, a graduate of Auburn and the GSD. Leg number 2, Serge Chermayeff, the ultimate cultured European, right? Who moved to this country in the 1940s and taught at Yale for quite a long time. And then Vincent Scully, our own homebrewed, right? New Haven born, Yale educated historian who I think taught you to look at history in a different way, but I'm going to ask you to talk about that. And then finally, the 4th leg, Kahn himself, because when you were a student here, and maybe many of the students don't know this, the top floor of the Yale University Art Gallery, the bit that faces Rudolph Hall, is where the architecture studios were. There was no Rudolph Hall. And so if I built a 4-legged stool with those 4 accomplished gentlemen holding it up, can you describe your education around those characters? And embellish, please.
Well, yesterday on arrival, going to that building, the Yale University Art Gallery, and going to the top 2 floors where the master's class and indeed the undergraduates were studying whilst the Art and Architecture building was being built, and which I worked on for, I think, $3.50 an hour for Paul Rudolph, doing cross-hatch lines. So if you look very, very closely at those immaculate drawings, you'll see that where
your hand.
Yes, on the cross-hatching. So yes, I mean, Kahn was an extraordinary architect and great heritage. And so that diagrid ceiling, interestingly, the way that architects learn from each other, that diagrid ceiling is pure Buckminster Fuller, could not have happened without Berke. You know, in the same way that Frank Lloyd Wright could not have done what he did without the time that he spent in Japan. So whether people talk about those influences or whether they're under the radar, as it were, nonetheless, they are powerful influences. I gave some hint about the influence of that time that I worked with the engineer on the tall building and the way that that has shaped the very nature of the current practice of which I'm still heading out. If these individuals as personalities, you could not imagine 2 more dissimilar people than Rudolph and Chermayeff. I mean, if Rudolph had the American crew cut, then Chermayeff had the slicked, brill creamed. If one had the blazer, the other had the Savile Row suit. I mean, and Rudolph was about action. If you did not have something on your drawing board, a model or a drawing to show, there was no conversation. It was about action. And that's a powerful incentive. I think it is about action. But of course, Shemaev was not interested in whatever might be on the drawing board. It was a conversation. It was about talking. It was about challenging. It was about listening. So perhaps the ideal in practice, and something that I've sought to extend as an influence, is the importance of different voices, is the opportunity to challenge, to question, but finally to act. And Vincent Scully, absolutely, bringing history alive. And if I think about so many of our projects, whether it's the Reichstag, whether it's the British Museum, the Treasury in London, the Royal Academy of Arts, and the Norton Museum, all of these buildings, they're all going back to their historic roots. It's a cliche perhaps, but if you really want to look far ahead into the future, then first look far back into the past. So yes, those three influences are still powerful influences today.
For you, I'm curious, before we go a little bit further, and I would like to remind all the students in the room that the action part of that comment, that there needs to be something on your desk, really still matters. That's just me, the educator, getting a little word in. But did students, both you and your colleagues in the class, feel torn in, let's call them, three potential different loyalties or influences, or were you all relatively successful in balancing the action, the intellectual approach, and the look at history?
Well, I know for myself, they were all complementary. They were never conflicting.
Okay.
And I'd like to believe that for colleagues who had the privilege of going through that course at the same time, that would ring true. So no, there was never a conflict. I mean, there was an extraordinary level of competition at that time. It was described as the most competitive environment. I mean, Rudolph would call a SNAP project a 24-hour project, and the whole school, everybody from year one through to the master's course, would do a design. And of course, it was 24 hours, and you were working for 24 hours. I think the work ethic proceeds here, and as I see that, I think that's really commendable and is a constant. I think going back in time, that competitive element was unusual and would be difficult, I think, to create today.
I think we encourage what I like to consider as healthy competition, along with a little bit of sleep.
From time to time.
Time to time, and a little bit of personal hygiene. We do like to have that happen. Yale was famous way back when, and long before you, meaning because, of course, the School of Art was the first graduate program at Yale, the first program at Yale to have women more than 150 years ago. And it was out of the School of Art that they started teaching design, and then eventually architecture, and then it eventually became, as it was when you were here, the School of Art and Architecture. And I'm going to use this question as a segue to what was at the end of your introduction, but to hear from you a little bit about any relationship the architecture students had with students in the arts while you were here at Yale. Was there overlap and exchange of ideas?
I don't remember an overlap and exchange of ideas, no. I think we were always aware of that heritage, Albers, all those links in the past. But as I remember it, I mean, it was as a course, it was so all-consuming that there was very little in the way of social life. But having said that, what we did do as a group, we did organize ourselves to, for example, to get to Penn and engage directly with Louis Kahn and his class there. So we, in between these charrettes, we found time to travel and visit some of the, pilgrimage trail of Frank Lloyd Wright and others.
I mean, that speaks to your comments earlier about the nature of collaboration and getting input from outsiders. And I know, through our friendship even and our conversations, that one of the things you very much enjoy isn't just building a space and letting the artist come along and put some work on the wall, but rather working with the artist.
Integrating. I mean, that image of the Hearst building, if you remember the entrance with the Jamie Carter icefall, which is part of the ecology of the building. So it's a heat sink. It's part of the environmental system, that waterfall. And then the Richard Long work above it. And I remember not too long after that building opened, sitting with two individuals, one a great supporter, Gil Maurer, great supporter of Yale, of drawing, and Frank Bennett, the president. And we were sitting at a table overlooking the escalators coming up. And they were talking together and they said, the power of architecture and art, you won't believe this, but it's changed the lives of those who come into this building. Before, they all came in to their individual domains, and now everybody's together here. And you know what? They dress up to come to the building.
That's true.
He said, literally a total change in lifestyle.
It's interesting. I'll add this observation, having gone to that building many, many, many times. Jamie Carpenter's an old friend, and Gil Maurer became a very good friend, particularly through his support for the school. Is that the other thing, you designed at the top of the escalator a space which Hearst devotes to art gallery space. And the other thing that people started to expect was that when they got to the top of the escalator, they didn't just go to the elevator to go to their office. They wanted to see something, and they expected to see drawings or models or sculpture, and they changed the show over time, and it was curated regularly. And I will say parenthetically, a couple of times they very graciously showed the drawings from our Rome program up there. But it was the inspiration of the space, Jamie's work, Richard Long's work, the long diagonal escalator. And then when you got there, you were also given yet one other piece of cultural or visual inspiration before you went to work.
Yes, it's a social heart of the of the many different enterprises, each with their own identity. So that gathering space, the restaurant, the snacks, the auditorium, the meeting place, the galleries, and as you say, on one occasion, the work of Yale students.
Yeah, it was terrific. Now, you showed us a picture that no one has seen yet in real life, which is the lobby of the JP Morgan building, which is about to open, I believe.
The ribbon cutting is next month.
Okay.
And that was a visualization, but the reality is exactly what I showed, and all of that has now come together. And what is interesting is that that as a building, I talked about the link between the social dimension and technology. The design of that structure is very unusual. It's a vast cantilever at the two entrance ends. There's the work of Maya Lin on Madison that you enter through, and then there's the directly off Park Avenue. And Park Avenue is quite interesting urbanistically. If you're next in New York and you say, just ponder the way in which the shoulders of those buildings, all a response to the setbacks of the original Manhattan grid, forms a lower shoulder and defines Park Avenue. But coming closer to JP Morgan, that cantilever, we double the density of the site. So it's twice as high, there are twice as many people. But that design delivers 2.5 times the amount of public space at the base of that building than the previous design. And a question that I'm often asked is, how can you justify in sustainability terms a tall, and usually at this point there's a kind of slight sneer of steel and glass, as if, you know, sort of a sort of critical aside. My answer to that is, have a look at a recent map prepared by 2 Berkeley researchers based on the carbon footprint based on household bills. And the map is of the East Coast. And when you look at it, it's a blur of red, orange, and yellow. And you look at the key, and the highest carbon footprint is red, and it goes down to yellow. But right at the bottom of the scale, the lowest is dark green. And if you look at that map carefully, you see a tiny dark green splodge, and that's Manhattan. And that is because it is a walkable, high density city, highly desirable, incidentally, if you look at all the surveys. So if you put sustainability to one side and you just say, you know, where do people want to go to work and so on, then New York constantly appears. It's not the car-borne city, it's the pedestrian-friendly, it's that with good quality public transport, with a rich mix of activities. So
you don't have to do a sales pitch on
it's
this
okay.
New Yorker. As the student, yes, New York City has the lowest carbon footprint of any place in the United States on a per capita basis, and it's for all the reasons you cite. But I want to build on this art discussion. Part of my question was, because I think if you haven't been on Park Avenue, you have no sense of the size of this building. But also its relationship to the grand boulevard that is Park Avenue, because most of New York's avenues don't feel like Park Avenue. They don't have the planting down the middle of the separation of traffic, the wider sidewalks. But where I was going was trying to give people a sense of the scale of the lobby. So what is the size of the Richter paintings? Because in that rendering, the people look like this and the paintings look
they're
like
about
this.
50 feet of that order, yes.
Okay.
But what is interesting also is recently visiting and seeing as the first kind of 500 people come in of the eventual 14,000 capacity of the building, that at the exchange level, which is a group of levels around 13, 14, 15, you get an idea of how a metropolis of the future could start to work at an elevated level. And interestingly, it was the chairman, Jamie Dimon, who said, you know, it's like being in a New York street up here. And he was in what is described as the Irish pub, Morgan's, and it's one of 17 venues. And it is interesting, the grid of the, almost like a micro city is at that elevated level. And with those different, it's very much a quality of a high street, quite interesting in terms of a possible taste of future urbanity.
Going back to the earliest conception of that building was one of the reasons JP Morgan interested in that site, because of its convenience, not only to the subway system, but to Grand Central Terminal and...
Well, it's extraordinarily well connected. I mean, literally there is the subway directly
down there,
below it.
and the train station a block away.
Yes. So, and historically, I think that JP Morgan have links in that area. So, and it is now extending to be much more a campus. So it's not just that building. It's a bigger overview.
I have a dozen other questions to ask you, but we have an audience full of people here, many of them architects, many of them I know. So I want to make sure the audience gets time for questions as well. Can I look across the room and have people raise their hands if they have a question for Norman Foster? Because if you're all shy, I'll just keep going, but I hope you're okay.
Thank you very much indeed. A quick question about your Carré d'Art in Nîmes. Should we think of that as a classical building?
I'd be complimented if you did think of it as a classical building. It has arguably many of the aspects of a classical building. It replicates the portico in contemporary terms of the Roman temple opposite. It's elevated above the floodplain. It's a low profile building, so it works hard at creating spaces below to enable the skyline to link into that part of Nîmes. So yes, I haven't thought of it in those terms, but I'd go along with it.
Wait for a microphone.
Thank you. I was wondering, from your journey starting from 16, is there anything that you would have changed or done differently from then until now?
Anything I would do differently from
what you started your tale at 16
yes.
in your introduction. So the question is, anything between the age of 16 and now you would have changed?
I'd have tried to do everything earlier.
And piggybacking off of that, is there any advice that you would give someone starting out at my stage, first year of Masters of Architecture?
Well, interestingly, when we launched the foundation in Madrid in the Opera House, and we had an audience of some 2,000, mostly young graduates or students. At one point on a panel, a question was directed at me: what advice would you give somebody graduating today? And without thinking too much about it, I retorted, I try and give the same advice that I give myself, and that's stay a student. And what do I mean by staying a student? As a student, you have the ability to question and to challenge. Because if you can't question and challenge when you're a student, then when will you be able to do? But you continue that tradition. But at the same time, it's also about listening and learning. So it's about being a good listener. But probably more than anything, it's about staying humble. And it's about continuing to be open. And in a conversation this morning, I elaborated a little further about that on the issues behind practicing architecture. And that is to get out onto the building site, to get out into the factories. This building, every building is, part is made in a factory, part is made on the site. Get into the factory, engage with those who are making, be part of that process. And that process is a continuum. It's not passing the parcel. As a creative act, it's going right down to the detail. It's going right down to the supervision on site. So design is, in that sense, it's a total activity. It's not just a drawing. Drawing is important, the computer's important. They're all tools, they're all important tools, but it's a continuum right down to the handover of the building, and ideally learning from its afterlife, because we're all imperfect, and the building is guaranteed. However you strive for perfection, it's not going to be perfect. So you have to try and learn from that as well.
In the middle of the audience there, man in the white shirt. Wait till the microphone comes to you.
I was very inspired by your commitment to teamwork in architecture. It's been a big inspiration of mine for my journey toward architecture. I was wondering, in your opinion, how an effective team comes together, one that delivers buildings of the quality that you are known for.
Well, over time, as an architect, and the evolution, the creation with colleagues of a practice, then you can't be hands-on on every project. So, so my way of indulging, if you like, of keeping sharp, is that I'm very, very closely linked into a select number of projects, which I have the privilege of being able to choose. My influence perhaps with colleagues is more remote. It's through crits, it's through evaluations along the way. If I start a competition, then that first meeting, just like that image that I showed with Berke, I get everybody together. I get the pin-up of the site, the program, and brainstorm with everybody. And I've done that most recently, interesting, with a competition that we won for the Queen Elizabeth Memorial. And literally those first meetings, we had the landscape architect Michel Devine from Paris zooming in, Adrien Lagarde, the museologist. We had the model makers. Everybody was linked in. Now, I'm not suggesting that you can design doing that, but you can get the ingredients, you get the information, you get a much richer, wider picture. And arguably it's more time consuming, but certain things come to the fore. And you have to create a creative environment for that to happen, because remember that just like many architects, those engineers have been educated with the idea that somebody is going to give them a problem and they're going to solve it. So on that little factory that I showed you for Reliance, that single pavilion, the first thing I got Tony Hunt as the engineer to do was, I said, I want you to do at least 10 hypothetical ideas of use any material, use concrete, use steel. And Tony had never been put in that position before, and he loved it. And he really became very much a part of the creative team. And it's interesting that total immersion in that project. I can give you the dimensions of every structural member in that building right now. So it's creating an environment where people feel confident to make a creative contribution, to step outside of their profession. And that requires a degree of self-confidence. But you can create that environment. And I assure you that you become a more powerful and more creative designer through that process.
Thank you.
There was somebody right down here. I'm sorry. Sorry, I promised this woman down here first. I know people have to leave for class, so don't worry if you have to slip out. We are at a university.
Thank you. So I guess I have a more practical question. So besides being a very successful architect, you're also a very successful businessman, if not the most successful among all architects. So my question is that, was there a moment during your running of the practice that you feel like you are you're facing a huge financial pressure or taking a huge financial risk, and how did you deal with it? Thank you.
I don't know how revealing to be on the I remember one one point where we'd taken it for granted that we were dependent on banks for overdrafts. And I remember that at one weekly meeting that I convened, that there was some question raised by the bank about renewing our overdraft. And I remember getting really angry and thinking, I'm going to lose the bank. I'm going to get rid of the bank. I'm not going to be dependent as a practice on the bank. And that was a point in time when I decided that if anybody wanted to commission us, then they would pay a fee up front for the privilege of commissioning us. And everybody around me said, this will be a formula for financial disaster because nobody will touch us. They'll go to our competitors. And I said, well, okay, that's fine. If anybody wants to leave the room, the door's there. And that was a complete turnaround financially for the practice. And interestingly, it empowered us as a practice, and it sorted out the time wasters, the people who, because I suddenly realized that as a profession, what we did is you invested a huge amount of work to get a project. By the way, I said there would be exceptions. There would be exceptions for those people who'd commissioned us before. There would be exceptions for worthy causes. There would be exceptions for those projects that we would do for charities on a pro bono basis, for a cultural institution. But if it was for a developer, then that was the new rule. And literally, we never had an overdraft after that. We were totally free of any dependence on banks. And you know, we were financially able to start also investing in more research equipment, more tools. So it raised the quality of our environment. It raised us creatively. So I think that inevitably, as a practice, you know, we are, the reality is we are in business.
You know what I would like to say? It is now 2 o'clock, and you have heard both creative inspiration and insightful business acumen. Go out there and make great buildings, and don't starve in the process. Thank you, Norman. It's been fabulous, fabulous to have you here with us at Yale.
Thank you.